appear like a conjurer's trick. Marta consulted her list again. "We have a week," she said. "The invitation has been sent. People are expecting something coherent." She did not say spectacular, but the ellipses hung between us nonetheless. Kurt began to produce names and possible press angles with the rapidity of someone shifting from damage control to opportunity, an adaptive mechanism that is as much about survival as it is about taste. "What do you think?" Marta asked finally, with the sort of frankness that in her meant the question was not rhetorical. I closed the piano and rested my hands on the fallboard, as if the wood itself might yield counsel. The thought that arrived then was not heroic. It was tidy, almost prosaic. We were making an event in which music would be admitted some of the time and painting the rest, where each discipline might compensate for the other, without either pretending to be whole on its own. This was not the return people wanted or expected. It was not a reclamation of a vanished palette, but an admission that the palette had shifted its axis. "Then we do it as that," I said. "We stage it honestly. We let the moments where I cannot hold the line be visible as part of the work. We ask the audience to witness the gaps as well as the fills." Marta exhaled a long breath. The folder made a soft tearing sound as she turned a page, and then she nodded once, the economy of a woman who could count costs and also, sometimes, understand risk. Kurt's shoulders dropped in a way that suggested he saw both the loss of easy headline and the possibility of a different story. Clara smiled then, small and private, as if a particular, necessary arithmetic had been completed. When the lights technician adjusted the band of illumination, I noticed the way the surfaces of Lena's canvases changed. Paint that had seemed flat now revealed its texture, the small ridges where her brush had paused and pressed. Such micro-topographies of gesture had always mattered to me in music, and seeing them in pigment felt like an extending of language across media. I had no illusion that the audience would unanimously accept the concession. There would be impatient critics who would call it sentimental, or opportunistic, or worse. But the dress rehearsal had done its essential work. It had made the fragility public, and therefore something to be reckoned with rather than secretly managed. We stopped for a moment and then rehearsed a final passage. Not because I feared perfection, but because I wanted to see whether the scaffolding we had improvised would hold under a small measure of pressure. This time, when the line rose and the cadence approached, I let my hands move without demanding from them the impossible memory of color. Instead, I watched Lena's hands at the edge of her canvas, the way she placed a thin, decisive red at the moment a phrase wanted punctuation. The note landed, and for a brief, exquisite instant the room registered continuity. It was not miraculous. It was not the restoration of what had been. It was an agreement. The painting would offer what it could and the music would answer, with its own economies. We turned the lights down then, and the rehearsal ended without drama. There was no triumphant applause. Marta closed her folder gently and handed me a list of small, practical things we would need before the evening: an extra chair for Leni, a mic at a particular angle, a mention in the program that the evening was a collaboration. Kurt made a few last exhortations about seats and then left in a flutter of phone calls. Clara walked me home a little later through streets that smelled of rain and baked bread. She did not offer fireworks, only the steady weight of company. I went to bed that night with the image of the slash of red on Lena's canvas repeating behind my eyes. It felt less like a remedy and more like an instruction. Accept the mark where you cannot fill the hole. The dress rehearsal had failed, and partly succeeded in the single, inconvenient way that matters in craft. It had shown precisely what we had to learn how to live with. The night outside my window in Vienna was ordinary trams calling, a dog barking once, a light in an upstairs flat going off and then on again, and there was, in that ordinariness, a small comfort. We were not on the brink of a spectacular restoration. We were at the beginning of a negotiation. The hook that stayed with me as I closed my eyes was plain and, perhaps, terrifying. The small concert would come, and I would sit before an audience not as someone returning fully formed, but as a man bearing anew, Compromised work? Whether they would receive it as honesty or as failure was beyond my control. The only thing I could do was to arrive and let the music be what it was, sometimes whole, sometimes not, and to trust that Lena's colors might, from time to time, tell the parts I could no longer see. I arrived at the gallery with an hour in which to be ordinary. The room was longer than its modest frontage suggested, a narrow, polite space that had once been a shop and had been emptied and scrubbed until its bones showed. White walls, two small banks of track lighting, a wooden floor that creaked a little when you shifted weight. Lena's canvases were arranged like witnesses behind the piano, washes of blue and ochre, a thin streak of red repeating in several panels, a gray that might be the size of a rest. They were not theatrical. They did not demand attention. They leaned, as if breathing in the same air as the instruments did when not speaking. Marta had insisted on that restraint. Nothing gaudy, she had said. We are small because we are honest. Kurt had smiled in a way that mixed commerce with hope and had suggested, in passing, that smallness could be sold as intimacy. Clara had placed a small vase of peonies near the coat stand, an oddly domestic concession that steadied me more than she could know. I had always understood the gallery as an examination room. For years performance had been a place in which I offered myself up to scrutiny. Perhaps that was why, on the small stage under the gallery lights, the old rituals returned with the clarity of muscle memory. I set my case beside the piano, opened the fallboard, and touched the first note gently, as one might test a sore tooth. The lacquer responded with a thin shiver that smelled faintly of wood glue and the cold night outside. I counted as I had always counted, not aloud but under my breath, 1, 2, 3. The counting felt absurdly ceremonial, a way to summon the old cartography of sound that no longer unfolded in color. People came in thin waves. There were only 30 or so in the room, faces I recognized and some I did not. A young woman Sophia's age sat in the front row and looked at me as if I might be a textbook specimen. An older man nodded to Clara in a way that suggested he found the enterprise both touching and mildly inconvenient. A small knot of journalists lingered by the door, more deferential than I expected. Felix, I thought, was not present. Perhaps he had sniffed a scent not worth following. Leni came in last, paint still at her nails, the braid at her back catching the light. She did not look small to me tonight. She looked resolved. She took her seat in the second row, and with the bluntness that had become her way, leaned forward and set her hands on her knees. She hummed a fragment under her breath that sounded, absurdly, like a bar I had once played to warm up. Clara stood at the side of the stage for a minute before sitting, and when our eyes met she lifted a brow, and then smiled the smallest, most practiced of smiles. Marta hovered at the back with a file of guest names, and an expression of a woman who had invented contingency plans for contingency plans. Kurt kept checking his watch and pretending not to. The gallery smelled faintly of turpentine and lemon polish, a clean smell, a smell that insisted on normality. I began with a piece I had chosen for its economy, spare voicings, clear line, something that might survive the fissures in me like a boat survives a choppy sea. The notes were not foreign to my hands. They sat in my muscles like remembered roots. Yet, even as the first phrase unfolded, I felt the peculiar absence of the private map into which I had once slipped without effort. Where there had been an immediate chromatic response that lit my path, there was now only the mechanical logic of the score and the uncertain architecture of my attention. My left hand reached for a low E that no longer arrived as blue. It arrived as wood and air, accurate but without the inner light I had relied upon. I noticed the audience in the small, unavoidable ways you notice people when the self is thin, a woman smoothing the hem of her skirt. A man leaning toward his companion as if to offer a small reassurance or to ask if they were sharing the same perception. Their faces were patient. They wanted to be moved. The first line I played sounded intact to them, perhaps because I could still make sound, because my technique had not wholly abandoned me. It sounded thin to me in the places that used to bloom. My hands were precise. The music was there. But when I moved into the second phrase and ornament, I had once allowed to spill into color, the timing frayed. A small tremor caught my right hand, and the phrase did not resolve where it should. The room, in that microsecond, tilted. It is a curious sensation to be exposed in public in a way that does not involve spectacle or scandal, simply the quiet, humiliating fact that you are not yourself. The sound went on, but I could feel the absence of an inner commentary that had taught me where emphasis belonged, and where surrender was not defeat but meaning. The audience heard a fractured phrase and filled the emptiness with the most generous of possibilities. They leaned in. In their leaning there was charity, an active willingness to make sense of the fragment. I was grateful and ashamed at once. After that first faltering, the program settled into an odd rhythm, clear passages, brittle fragments, repair. Somewhere in the middle of a slow nocturne, I lost the inner line entirely and simply held a chord until I found the next note. Holding chords is an odd, intimate act. You listen to their decay. You watch how the timbre changes with the room's small movements. I held a chord and felt, through the floor, the beat of someone clapping too early in the next room, a break that made my hand tighten. In that pause, an audience member laughed softly, an unintentional punctuation, and I looked up, embarrassed. Leanie was looking at me. Her face was impassive but intent. She tapped the small sketchbook on her knee and then, with an almost imperceptible motion, pressed 2 fingers to her lips and shook her head once, as if to say, not yet. She was not asking me to do better. She was marking presence. There is a moment in small performances when everything could go either way. You can apologize with virtuosity or accept the silence. I have always been allergic to theatrical contrition. Tonight, the wrongness of the music felt like a failure to perform than a fissure through which something other might enter. Lena's paintings, those patient, unassuming swaths of color behind me, sat like a different language on the wall. People do not generally imagine that a painting can perform, but the room was not large. The canvases occupied the audience's peripheral vision, and peripheral vision is a secret register of feeling. A wash of blue in the left-hand painting matched, in my mind, the pitch my ear could no longer render as indigo. A thin red line pulsing through several canvases caught at the rhythm of a staccato I could not shape. It was not epiphany. It was not magic. It was, rather, a slow, almost clinical matching that Leanie had provided without theatrical intent. Midway through the program, I played a fragment I had written in the weeks since the last rehearsal. It was spare, a string of repeated intervals with deliberate gaps. The manuscript in front of me was annotated only in my cramped hand. Pause, let canvas answer an absurd note to myself that read like superstition. On the printed page, the silence asks less of the performer than of the audience. Will they carry the pause or will they let it fall? I placed my hands on the keys and began. The first 2 bars were precise. Then, as I had annotated, I stopped. I did not fill the silence. I did not attempt the flourish that might have dressed the gap. I waited. The gallery's tick of the heating register, the soft breathing of chairs, a distant siren, these made a quiet scaffold. In the hush, something subtle happened. A ripple went through the room, not quite audible but certainly felt. It was as if eyes found the paintings to pick up the displaced line. A woman a few rows back inhaled, and in that inhalation her shoulders rose as if the missing phrase had been completed inside her. When I resumed, the passage felt different. My note choices had been informed by the way Leanie had painted the panels she had put behind me, the blue on the left like a sustaining hand, the red like a punctuation. I could not claim that the sound had been repaired. I could claim, honestly, that the gap had been respected and that the audience had, with a generosity I had not expected, allowed image and silence to collaborate. After the concert, an older man would tell me that in that pause he could see the color shift, and in seeing it he heard the rest. Whether he had seen color or projected it, he could not say. That uncertainty is the point. The evening asked little of certainty and more of willingness. Not everything went in that direction. At one point near the end, a passage I had once played with the speed of reflex turned brittle and came apart entirely. My right hand misjudged an appoggiatura and landed on a hammering dissonance before correcting. The audience flinched as if someone had suddenly spoken too loudly in a chapel. I felt my face grow hot and then colder, as if the failure flushed me and then withdrew blood. I wanted to apologize or to make some deft, dazzling recovery. Instead, I gripped the case of the piano with both hands, drew air in slowly, and put my fingers back on the keys. Clara's hand brushed my sleeve and then squeezed. It was a small, contained pressure that registered as both chastisement and consolation. Marta's lips pressed together into a line that calculated risk and consequence at the same time. From somewhere near the back, a child, the gallery, had allowed a couple of small children in. Sensible though it might seem, whispered it's okay to her mother in a tone of surprising authority. The phrase made me want to laugh and to cry. It is a particular kind of honesty to play imperfectly in front of people who love you in complicated ways. The applause at the end was not the ovation of restoration. It was polite and immediate, a patter of hands that respected effort rather than rewarded miracle. People stood eventually, more because the program had ended than because they were compelled. There was no rapture in the room. There was a kind of shared inventory taking. Kurt whispered to Marta about opportunities. Marta considered the small calculations that might make this modest success into something sustainable. Clara walked up the narrow steps and stood behind me while I closed the lid. She did not speak for a moment. Then she said, in a voice equal parts logician and tenderness, "You did something that was not falsified." The phrase sounded like a verdict and like a benediction. In the corridor after the concert, the conversation braided itself into small strands. A younger woman, Sophia's friend, perhaps found me and said, shyly, that she had been moved by the pauses. An older patron, stopping me with surprising bluntness, said he found the juxtaposition of image and sound honest in a way the great halls rarely are. Marta, already half in management mode, began to speak of a modest series of salons. Kurt added that he might find a sponsor with local connections. Leni stood to the side, quiet as a hinge, and when I bent down to her she looked up and said, simply, "They saw it, didn't they?" The question felt too large for the small corridor. I wanted to tell her everything, that the night had not returned the colors to me, that the world had not brightened in some miraculous way, that the accident still lived in the crevices of my attention. Instead, I said, with a soft, inadequate honesty, they were willing to pretend for a bit. Sometimes pretending is the beginning of something real. She nodded, as if that were a useful, practical observation. On the tram home the city felt the same and different. Vienna at night is a city of lamplight and distant traffic, a city that has known many kinds of music and many kinds of silence. I sat with my hands on my knees, palms flat, and tried to count what had happened in the night. There was undeniably failure. I had not performed with the old certainty, nor had I summoned the private palate that had once been the scaffolding of my art. Yet there had been a conversation. It had been uneven and furred with all the complications of public life, expectation, pity, commerce, but it had been a conversation. For the first time in months, I felt a small loosening in the tightness that had lived behind my breastbone. Not joy, not consummate hope. A cautious recognition that an altered method might yet be a method. I think, in the end, that what unsettled people most was not my imperfection, but the refusal of a spectacle that would hush all doubt with a triumphant gesture. People had been willing to attend to the lacuna, to let the canvas occupy the places my hearing no longer could. Whether that was collaboration or sleight of hand, I could not say. There is a moral question there. Am I asking an audience to lend me its imagination in order to smooth over my deficit? If I am I culpable in that barter, or is there a deeper ethical transaction in which representation and absence together disclose a different truth? That is the question that will sit at the edge of my thinking for some time. When I turned the key in my front door that night, and the hallway light went on, Clara's coat was on the peg, and there was the smell of the peonies, still faint, in the sitting room. Lena's paint-smeared fingers left a small, indelible point on my sleeve where she had, in the foyer, insisted on a clumsy hug. Her mother had already gone home. Anja had texted a brief, laconic message. She did good. Thank you. I went to the piano, sat for a while, and did not play. I sat instead with silence, the hush that had opened during the concert now present in my flat with no audience to cushion it. The silence was not empty. It was a place where, perhaps, something could be assembled slowly, pages of a modest score, the patient arrangement of canvases and sound. It was possible that night had been a kind of provisional rehearsal for a style of making that did not pretend to restoration. There is a hook to endings that is irresistible, that which closes will also open. For now, the opening is small and uncertain. I sleep that night with a coat of black paint under one fingernail and a sense of continuing. The city outside is patient. Leni will bring me another canvas tomorrow. Marta will call with more cautious proposals. Kurt will speak of sponsorship, and Clara will speak of the practicalities of a life that need not be dominated by concert cycles. I hold these possibilities like fragile instruments, useful if handled with care, dangerous if offered to a crowd hungry for miracle. The night was not a return. It was a beginning that keeps its eyes down. Whether that beginning will become a path or a rhetorical turn I cannot yet tell. But the fact that I left the gallery with the small, embarrassing knowledge that people can be made to hear color if color is provided to them in another register, this, I think, is enough to keep me at the bench. I walked home along the canal, the water dark and placid under the lamplight. In a shop window a child had drawn a line of chalk that might have been a staff or a horizon. I paused and watched a dog stir in its sleep behind a radiator. The world, at that hour, seemed available for small alterations. My hands were not empty. They were complicated instruments marked by failure and practice, memory and the clean, stubborn will to continue. Tomorrow Leni would come with new panels. We would adjust distances and lighting, mark the pauses in my manuscript with more care. It was conceivable, now, that my music could live in a shared architecture, sometimes sound leading, sometimes silence, sometimes pigment. There would be failures. There would be small reconciliations. There would be days of shame. And there would be nights like this one, which refused the easy salvage and instead offered an ambiguous, human present. I left the canal and the city to its ordinary noises and went home, carrying in my pocket the faint scent of turpentine and the memory of a pause that had been observed like a tiny rite. The hook, if there is one, is a small image, a child in the audience no more than 7 who, as I passed her in the foyer, looked up at me with the naked curiosity of someone who had not yet learned the professional scripts of disappointment. She drew a finger across the air between us, making a thin, invisible line, and said, very plainly, "That's the blue." I did not ask who had taught her that color. I simply held my hand half out, as if in answer, and in that moment there was a mutual, unguarded recognition that art could hinge on modest acts of translation, and that those translations, tenuous and improvised, might be enough to go on. The morning after the gallery felt less like a continuation than a new ledger opening, the same objects, the same kettle, the same spilled light on the table. But the account of what had happened the evening before had been written elsewhere in columns, in emails, in small, officious phone messages, and now it returned to me in various voices. I made tea as if the ritual could ordain order. I sat at my small table and opened the paper Felix had sent, his article already warmed by the day, elder-styled and eager to assert that he had seen the thing in full. Felix's voice was recognizable even in print, a mixture of curiosity and the appetite for an arc. He began, as he always did in long profiles, with atmosphere, the gallery's cold air, the hush, the way paint pooled like silence on the wall, and then slid into a kind of interpretive generosity that did not quite disguise the calculation underneath. His piece asked more questions than it answered. Was the performance a moral reset, aesthetic fraud, a new form? He left his reader mid-judgment, which was useful for him because it allowed every reader to supply their own prejudices. The paragraph that stayed with me most was not a verdict, but a small observation that the room, in its modest scale, had required less of me, and more of each listener. And that this redistribution of labor might be, in itself, the work's point. Reading Felix felt like holding a glass up to my face. I could see small, distorted reflections of myself, but the surface trembled with his tone. I finished my tea with the paper folded beside the plate, and the kettle cooling on the stove. And Leanie wandered into the kitchen with the easy unconcern of a person who had not yet learned that other people's words could press upon the chest with gravity. She carried with both hands a small canvas wrapped in brown paper. "We sell many?" she asked simply, looking at me with the blunt cordiality one reserves for business partners or people who supply biscuits. Her question had no ambition in it. It was direct and practical. "Not many," I said, and I thought of the few paintings that had found buyers, 2 neighbors, a woman from the conservatory who wanted a keepsake of that night, and the rest that had been carried home and leaned against my piano as if to watch me practice. She unwrapped the canvas with the same careful hands I had seen place splashes of color in the gallery. The paint smelled faintly of turpentine. It reminded me of my mother's little kitchen, where she would wash brushes in a jam jar. The painting was small and economical, a wash of gray at the bottom, a wedge of muted blue like a low chord, and, across the right edge, a quick stroke of apricot that seemed to slice the gray. She looked at me, waiting for the evaluation I had long made another people's work beer. "Some people said they felt it," she announced, as if she were reporting the weather. I smiled, not because the critics had been kind, but because she had taken the messy, complicated language of reception and reduced it to a fact. Some people felt it. There was a bracing clarity in that simplicity. Leanie did not seem to need the wide, hungry apparatus of publicity to determine meaning. She trusted sensory consequence paint that echoed tone, and I found that trust restorative. Marta arrived at noon, her presence as precise as the cut of her jacket. She did not bring condolences. She brought a ledger and a set of proposals. She sat, removed her glasses, and laid the papers between us. "Listen," she said, and began with the businesslike rhythm that had steered my career for years. "Televised interest," she said. "A charity gala with broad reach. A summer festival that would be kind on programming but heavy on cameras. The gallery did what we needed it to do," she observed without sentiment. "It repositioned you as interesting again. That is marketable." I watched her move a pen across the page as she spoke, making calculations I had once made alongside her. Days of rehearsal, potential fees, requirements. I listened to the arithmetic of opportunity in the same way a pianist listens to a metronome. The steady click marked choices. Marta's matrix offered a return to the old circuit's visibility, approval, the possibility of reclaiming a schedule that proved worth the sacrifices it demanded. It also offered a version of me that I did not recognize, a man who would be asked to perform for redemption rather than the pleasure of music, who would be scheduled into narratives other people's hands wrote. "It will pay," Marta said, reading the question that had selected itself in my eye. "It will put you back where publishers will call, where festivals will ask." Her voice admitted no moral argument. It offered only feasibility. Clara arrived later in the afternoon, bearing a simple tray with coffee and 2 croissants. She moved in a quieter orbit than Marta. Where Marta counted, Clara weighed. She sat opposite, watched us for a long moment, and then said, "You can't not answer them. But you can choose which ones to answer." Her sentence was not counsel so much as the tight offering of an available principle. Clara has long been the human scale voice in my life, the one that names compromise without romanticizing it. Who knows how to make music fit into an everyday that is not hostile to tenderness. She was not telling me to refuse. She was telling me to discriminate. Our conversation unrolled in small, precise terms. Marta catalogued the offers. Kurt's voice entered the room through a short, impatient call that Marta answered, his cadence clipped, eager to convert attention into boxes of audience numbers. He wanted a comeback series at a local hall, a compact festival slot that would be televised in excerpts. It would be tasteful, he said, but his taste was market-shaped. What he could not quite conceal was the profit line. He used the word brand in a sentence that made both Clara and me wince. I felt the linen between the offers and the life I hoped to live thin as tissue paper.